Okay, today we're going to figure out how to tell the difference between a sine and cosine graph. When given a graph, how do we know which it is? And we did this in the last video kind of briefly, but we're going to write it down and look at it again. We know it's a sine graph or a cosine graph. The first thing we have to do is look at the y-intercept. Okay, where does the graph hit the y-axis? So this first one, here's our y-intercept. Now, relative to all the other points on that graph, that point is what we would call a maximum point or a high point. If the y-intercept is a maximum point, or if it were a minimum point, if this point down here was where it was hitting the y-axis, then that would mean we have a cosine graph. Okay, so if our y-intercept is a max or a min, the highest point or the lowest point on the graph, we have a cosine graph. If we look at this other one, our y-intercept is in the middle. Okay, when our y-intercept is in the middle, it's a sine graph. So knowing that, we can write down y equals a cosine bx, and this one is y equals a sine bx. So in order to write the equation of the given graph, we have to figure out, is it a cosine graph or is it a sine graph? And we get that from looking at the y-intercept. Okay. The next thing we have to do is determine a. Determine the value of a. And for a, it's just a little formula. Okay, remember, now this is different from what we've done. We don't have the equation, we're coming up with the equation. When we had the equation, a was the amplitude. Well, here we're finding the value of a, or the value of the amplitude. And the way we figure that out is we find the maximum y value, and we subtract the minimum y value, and we divide that by 2. So if we look up here, for this one, our maximum y value is 1. Our minimum y value is -1. So a is going to be our maximum y value minus our minimum y value over 2. So in this case, 1 minus -1 is 2 over 2, gives us a is 1. So now we know we have 1 cosine something. If we look at this graph, again, same formula. It doesn't matter if it's sine or cosine. A is going to be the maximum, which on this graph is 2, minus the minimum, which on this graph is -2. So we do 2 minus -2 over 2. That gives us 4 over 2, which is 2. So for this one, we know we have 2 sine something. Now, the last thing we need to find out is we need to determine b. Okay, b is the frequency, and that is, if we remember from the last, frequency is the number of full curves in 2 pi. And just to review, a full cosine curve kind of looks like a U or an upside down U. A sine curve looks like a sideways S. That's what the full curve should look like. So if we look at this first one, here's our cosine graph. We look from 0 to 2 pi. So we're just looking at this graph. Is this from 0 to 2 pi a full U? No. What part of the U is it? It's a half. Okay, so how many curves are we seeing in 2 pi? We're seeing a half a curve, so that means b is a half. So our equation for this one is y equals 1 cosine 1/2 x. Or we don't really need the 1 in the front. Just cosine 1/2 x. Now we look over here at our sine graph. So we're going from 0 to 2 pi. So we trace it out. Well, that's one full sine curve, but we're not at 2 pi yet. That's 2 full sine curves. There are 2 full curves in 2 pi. So our equation for this one is 2 sine 2x, because between 0 and 2 pi, there's 1 sine graph, 2 sine graphs. So our frequency, how many are there? There are 2 in 2 pi. Frequency is how many in 2 pi. And again, this is page 16 in the notes. So now, I had page 17 right here somewhere. Let's go to page 17. Here it is. Okay. So now we go to page 17. We do the same thing. First step, is it a sine or a cosine? So I go to my y-intercept. Y-intercept's in the middle. When the y-intercept is in the middle of the graph, it's not the highest point, it's not the lowest point. When it's the middle, that means we have a sine graph. Okay. Now the next thing we have to figure out is what's A. So here's where we look at our maximum and our minimum. And remember, A is the max minus the min over 2. So we look at this one. A is going to be 1 minus negative 1 over 2. So we have 2 over 2 again. So in this one, A is 1. It's a sine graph. Now to find B, we have to see how many full sine curves we see in 2 pi. So let's start tracing. There's 1 complete S. There's 2. There's 3. So I see 1, 2, 3 full sine curves from 0 to 2 pi. That's what B is, the number of full sine curves between 0 and 2 pi. And again, let's just remember, sine looks like an S, cosine looks like a U or an upside down U. Okay? And again, you don't really need the 1 in front. You could just write sine 3x. This next one, go to a y-intercept. Y-intercept is at a minimum point. Okay, that means this is a cosine graph. Okay, so now we have to figure out what A is. So we need our max and our min. And again, max is 1, min is negative 1. So we're getting another 2 over 2, which is 1. So now we have y equals 1 cosine. And now we have to figure out what B is. Okay, so we start and we see we're going from 0 to 2 pi. So there's 1 upside down U. There's 2 upside down U's. So I see 2 cosine curves in 2 pi. So that's 1 cosine 2x. Now, the only thing is a cosine curve really should be a U when we start off, but here it's upside down. When it's upside down, this means the A is negative. So we have to make this one a negative cosine 2x to make sure we get it upside down. Okay, so again, the steps. Is it sine or cosine? Look at your y-intercept. Middle is a sine curve. Max or min is a cosine curve. Second step, find your A value. A is going to be max minus min over 2. It doesn't matter if you're sine or cosine. Max y, min y. Max y, min y. And then B is how many curves do we see in 2 pi? So we see both of these graphs go to 2 pi. We count. You have to know a sine curve is like a sideways S. You have to go up and down and back up. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3 sine curves. So that's why we have sine 3x. Cosine is just 1 up. It's either a U or an upside down U. In this case, upside down. So there's 1, 2 in 2 pi. And when it's upside down, it gets a negative. Okay, the last one. Is this a sine or a cosine? Well, we go to our y-intercept. Y-intercept is in the middle, so that's a sine graph. We find A by doing max minus min over 2. Our max is 2, our min is negative 2. 2 minus negative 2 is 4. 4 over 2 is 2. So we have y equals 2 sine, and now we have to figure out B. Well, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3. That's 3 full sine curves in 2 pi. So that means B is 3. So we have 2 sine 3x. Okay, so to determine the equation given a graph, you have to figure out, is it sine or cosine by looking at the y-intercept. Then find A by doing the max minus min over 2. And then finally find B by counting how many curves you see.